This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 713 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. The 2022 NBA season is in full swing, and FanDuel and DiGiorno are teaming up to give fans the opportunity to go to an NBA game of their choice this season. To enter the sweeps, all you have to do is go to FanDuel.com/DiGiorno. And be on the lookout for DiGiorno's next free-to-play NBA DFS contest, Friday Night Hoops. DiGiorno's Friday Night Hoops NBA DFS contest is set to begin Friday night, November 25th. In the meantime, head to FanDuel.com/DiGiorno to enter for a chance to win a trip to the NBA game of your choice. That's FanDuel.com/DiGiorno. No purchase necessary, age and location restrictions apply, void where prohibited. See full terms at FanDuel.com. Sell Jamaal Williams. So most people understand that Jamaal Williams won't score 3 touchdowns every single week. That's what he did in week 11. But a lot of people are still intrigued by the guy who's leading the NFL in rushing touchdowns. Williams is now ranked as an RB to a top 24 running back in 4 consecutive games in PPR formats. He's averaging 17.3 points per game during that stretch. And while he's averaging 64 yards per game on the ground, nothing wrong with that, the main reason he's been so relevant is touchdowns, period. He has 6 rushing touchdowns over his last 4. He's accounted for almost 55% of Detroit's offensive touchdowns during this stretch. Since 2011, only 2 running backs have finished a season with more than 50% of their team's offensive touchdowns. Neither of those running backs were able to get to that 55% mark. That's just me showing you that regression is almost inevitable. And both of those players, it was Maurice Jones-Drew in 2011 and Christian McCaffrey in 2019. Both of them were pass catchers. They had multiple ways of finding the end zone. That's not the case for Jamaal Williams. Williams has not seen a single target in 3 consecutive games. And they were also full-time players, MJD and CMC were. Williams has played more than half of Detroit's snaps just once this year. Basically, Williams is lacking some of the key things that we're looking for in fantasy running backs. He's seeing goal line work. That's great. The Lions clearly are not afraid to give him the rock close to the goal line. That's not going to go away. And Detroit doesn't have a bad schedule moving forward. It's just that what he's currently doing is not sustainable. We want guys who are catching passes out of the backfield. We want guys who are on the field a lot. We want high snap shares. There's a correlation between those things and scoring fantasy points. Now, to see how the market was viewing Jamaal Williams, I posted a Twitter poll. I know this is very, very scientific. But I wanted to ask people who they would prefer in half PPR leagues moving forward. Jamaal Williams or Jeff Wilson? And about 55% of people prefer Jamaal Williams. But I'm on the Wilson side. It's not by a ton, but I do like Jeff Wilson more than Jamaal Williams. He's someone playing a higher percentage of his team's snaps. His offense is better. His schedule, it's relatively comparable. Most importantly, he's not just seeing rushing work, but Wilson's seeing receiving work too. We can sit here and say that DeAndre Swift isn't seeing that big of a workload in that offense. He's not seeing the field that much. Well, DeAndre Swift's snap share in week 11 was greater than Raheem Mostert's in week 10. Like I said, Williams isn't going to go away. I'm just looking at some of the responses to that poll, tweets saying things like, I'll take the guy leading the NFL in touchdowns, or I'll take the guy who's seeing 5 goal line looks a game, which isn't even true. People want their touchdowns, and understandably so. Jamaal Williams is a pleasant surprise this season. He's been great, but don't let recency bias overshadow what's to come. From a process standpoint, this is a classic case of selling high. Of course, anything can happen. Of course, he can just score a touchdown every single week through the rest of the season. You have to be open to that. That's what variance is. But logic and math tell us that Jamaal Williams is a sell. Add Demarcus Robinson. So Rashad Bateman aggravated his foot injury back in week 8 against the Buccaneers. And as we know, he's done for the year. He hasn't played since. Counting that game against Tampa Bay, Baltimore's played 3 games without Rashad Bateman. And in those games, Demarcus Robinson has seen target shares of 23.5%, 19%, and 28.1%. He's seen amazing target shares without Rashad Bateman. Now, Devin Duvernay is running as the team's top receiver. But Robinson is the one who's getting it done. He's coming off a 9-catch, 128-yard day. He's looking like Lamar Jackson's preferred option at wide receiver. That makes him roster worthy. Buy Allen Lazard. So oftentimes when I buy and sell players, I like to play into narratives. I like to do the opposite of what people are probably thinking. And what people are probably thinking right now is Christian Watson is that dude. Which, yeah, I talked about this last week. I've talked about Christian Watson over the last month on this show. I like Christian Watson in this offense this season. I think he has at least a chance to be a league winner down the stretch. But what this does when everyone's so focused on a guy like Watson, it pushes Allen Lazard to the background. But Lazard is still seeing more consistent work in that Green Bay offense. He's actually had at least a 20% target share in every single game since week 3. And he's coming off a game in week 11 where his target share was almost 30%. Christian Watson in that game had a 16% target share. So everyone is understandably excited about Watson. I am too. But that might open up an opportunity to swoop in and get Allen Lazard. Add Darius Slayton. So I probably should have talked about Darius Slayton on last week's 15 transaction show. But instead I featured him on the Sleeper show. But now you definitely have to add him. Wan'Dale Robinson unfortunately suffered a torn ACL against the Lions on Sunday. He's going to be sidelined the rest of the year. But regardless of that injury and what it could do to Slayton's overall volume, the target share was already there. Slayton's averaged a target share per game of over 21% over his last 6. He's now scored at least 11.6 PPR points in 4 consecutive games. I'm not really worried about the Giants' schedule moving forward either. It's pretty average. Slayton's currently available in about half of Yahoo leagues. He should be added this week. Hold Najee Harris. So we finally got a big game from Najee Harris. And all it took was an injury to Jaylen Warren, kind of. Let's not take anything away from Harris. Yes, Jaylen Warren left Pittsburgh's game against Cincinnati early. But Harris still finished the day with a 45% success rate. That's pretty good. He had 20 carries for 90 yards. And he saw every single Pittsburgh running back rush for the first time this season, en route to almost 28 PPR points. It was a great day for Najee Harris. And he looked pretty good too. Now, obviously, you might be sitting back and saying, okay, finally I can sell Najee Harris high. I'm just not sure the market is buying Najee Harris even after this performance. And the thing is, the Steelers actually have a pretty nice schedule moving forward for Harris. They have the 8th best one by adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs from week 12 through 17. And then in weeks 15 to 17, it's the 2nd best. So they have the 2nd best running back schedule in the fantasy playoffs. In weeks 15 and 16, they get the Panthers and the Raiders. So there's a chance that we see some decent performances from Najee Harris down the stretch. I don't think this is really the time to sell high unless you absolutely can sell high. Add James Cook. So back in week 2 against the Titans, James Cook had a season-high 55% running back rush share. But if you remember that game, it got out of hand. The Bills crushed the Titans. So in that blowout, they gave James Cook a little bit more run. In week 11, so this past week, Cook saw his 2nd highest running back rush share of the season. But this game was a little bit different. It was a whole lot closer. Cook was seeing work in the 2nd and 3rd quarter. The game hadn't been won yet. And he had 11 carries for 86 yards, and he had a couple of targets through the air. Now, Devin Singletary is their dude in the backfield. He's the guy you obviously want. But Cook could have some flex appeal moving forward. And at the very least, he's a Singletary handcuff. Buy Antonio Gibson. So for anyone wanting to make a more volatile move, I think buying Antonio Gibson might be for you. Since Brian Robinson returned to the football field, he's out-attempted Antonio Gibson in every single game. 6 straight games of more Robinson on the ground than Antonio Gibson. But in week 11, that changed. Not only did Gibson see more work on the ground than Robinson, he had a season-high 67% snap share. And guys, that wasn't a really positive game script. Historically, or at least over the last month and a half, that would have favored Brian Robinson a lot more. J.D. McKissick is now out for the year. The Commanders have a 2-headed backfield. It's Gibson and Robinson. Gibson is more of the pass catcher. Robinson has been more of the grinder. Gibson's actually seen a double-digit percentage target share in each of his last 7 games. It's pretty amazing. But if Gibson's now seeing more work on the ground, That's a really good running back workload. But this is a risky transaction because the Commanders could easily just go back to Robinson. This is just a one-game trend. But at the very least, we know that Gibson's seeing the pass catching work. In PPR formats, he's been absolutely fine. And the thing is, he's coming off a game in a really, really good matchup against Houston where his performance wasn't that incredible. It's not like he found the end zone a couple of times. That's why I think you still might be able to buy him right now. Sell Curtis Samuel. So in that same offense, we have Curtis Samuel. He's been pretty mediocre in fantasy over the last month. Taylor Heineke took over that offense in week 7. Since that point in time, Samuel's averaged a target share per game of 15.7%. With Carson Wentz, that number was over 22%. And his fantasy numbers have obviously taken a hit. He scored 11.3 PPR points per game with Taylor Heineke. And that's while scoring 2 touchdowns across his 5 games. And he's coming off a performance where he scored another touchdown. So there might be an opportunity to sell high with Curtis Samuel. Maybe. The fact of the matter is, this is Terry McLaurin's offense once again, as it should be. Add Samaje Perine. So sometimes these transactions are really easy. Joe Mixon was ruled out of their Week 11 game against the Steelers because he had a concussion. Samaje Perine stepped in. He handled 11 of 13 non-Mixon running back rushes. But most importantly, he played the pass-catching role, as he does in that offense. He caught 3 of his 4 targets for 3 touchdowns. He had a monster day. So if Mixon misses time, Perine's the guy that you would want. Buy Ramondre Stevenson. So some fantasy managers might look at the box score from Sunday and see that Damian Harris outrushed Ramondre Stevenson 65-26. And really, Harris did look better on the ground than Stevenson. He had a 50% success rate. Stevenson was at 13%. Stevenson's peripheral numbers, though, they were still great. He played 79% of New England snaps against the Jets. That was the 3rd highest mark of his season. He ran the 2nd most routes for the Patriots overall. And he continues to be a massive piece of their passing game. Ramondre Stevenson has hit a 22% target share in 4 consecutive games. Damian Harris is going to limit Ramondre Stevenson's ceiling a little bit. But with a pretty reasonable rest of season schedule, I think Stevenson's going to be just fine. In fact, I think he's going to be more than fine. That's why you can buy him. Add Kyren Williams. A lot of attention's probably going to be given to Cam Akers on the waiver wire this week. He had 14 carries in their game against New Orleans, but I'm kind of intrigued by Kyren Williams. We know the Rams are not a good football team. That could lead to a lot of negative game scripts. In week 11, Kyren Williams ran 20 routes. He was the team's primary pass catching option. He also ended up playing 10 more snaps than Cam Akers did. Darrell Henderson only had 6.5% of the team's snaps. Now, I wouldn't want to really rely on any Rams running back moving forward. But Williams is probably the easiest to snag off the waiver wire this week because more attention is going to be put on Cam Akers. I think Williams is going to be cheaper. And I'm not sure there's that much of a difference between those 2 players in PPR formats. Buy A.J. Brown. So it's been back-to-back kind of mediocre performances from A.J. Brown. I don't think it's time to panic, though. Brown only had 9 PPR points on Sunday, and he was out-targeted by Devontae Smith. But he still finished with a 30% target share. The Eagles played their first game without Dallas Goedert, and we saw Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown capture almost 70% of the team's targets. So basically, the target ceiling is going to be there for A.J. Brown week in and week out. So the production will inevitably follow. Add Latavius Murray. So in somewhat of a surprise move, the Broncos waived Melvin Gordon on Monday. He's had issues with fumbling this season, but it still wasn't necessarily expected, and that's especially true because on Monday it was announced that Chase Edmonds has a high ankle sprain. He hurt his ankle on Sunday. In other words, it's Latavius Murray's time. Murray had his best backfield share numbers of the season in Week 11. He had 63% of the team's running back rushes and a 14.3% target share. I think we should expect those kinds of numbers moving forward, which are good numbers. But someone's got to back him up, right? In the short term, that's likely going to be Marlon Mack. So in deeper leagues, you could look Mack's way. But then it gets even more complicated. Mike Boone is eligible to return from IR in Week 13. And he's someone who can make some noise if he's healthy enough down the stretch. And I highly doubt your league mates are going to be really into Mike Boone this week off the wire, so you can get him for pretty cheap. But Latavius Murray, he's the priority ad. If you want to take a shot on Marlon Mack, that makes plenty of sense too. As does Mike Boone, who probably has a little bit more upside than Mack given the talent profile. It's just that the injury could make him not as attractive. But Latavius Murray, he's your guy this week. Add Jamaal Williams. So Jamaal Williams is reportedly returning from the PUP. That means he's back on our fantasy football radars. Just so you guys know, if you weren't around for prospect season, he was a 95th percentile prospect in my model. He ranked just behind Drake London, Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, and Treylon Burks in that order entering the season. Or I guess exiting the draft. He's someone who can stretch the field and make splash plays, and if he's healthy, if he's playing, he needs to be on fantasy rosters. Because the Lions really don't have a secure second option in their passing attack right now. Williams could hypothetically play that role. And yes, I'm using the term hypothetically. We don't know how healthy he really is. We don't know exactly when he's going to return, at least at the time of this recording. You just can't wait and see, though. So you should be adding him this week. Add the Miami Dolphins defense. With the Dolphins having a bye in Week 11, they're now available in a lot of leagues. And they get the Texans in Week 12. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, Miami's an 11.5 point home favorite. Houston has just a 17-point implied team total. And the Texans are the third most advantageous matchup for team defenses in fantasy football when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. And get this, they've allowed a top 7 defensive performance in each of their last 5 games. So Miami, a great play this week. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. Remember to check out LateRound.com. You can join the Patreon for weekly rankings, rest of season rankings, live Q&As, and more. But you can also subscribe to the free newsletter. That's where my written content is going these days, including the 15 transactions column. So check it all out, LateRound.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow.